Ezekiel 3:17 says, "Son of man, I've made you a watchman over the house of Israel." And in each generation, what a joy it is to see that God raises up people of faith to be those watchmen. And how blessed we are today to have two of those men today that have faithfully served God over all these years of ministry. In the same place, I was able to see them one other time. This was in Cape Town in 2010. Apparently, it's only the second time they've spoken together. These are longtime friends. And so what a privilege it is to have them here today. Dr. Os Guinness, many of you have read his books and heard him speak. His name is of worldwide renown, and he's used it for the common good. His book, published in 1973 by the powerful title Dust to Death, was earth-shattering for a generation of Christians who were struggling to respond to the countercultural. Born in China, Oz is the great-great-grandson of Arthur Guinness, the Dublin brewer. He was witness to the climax of the Chinese Revolution in 1949 and returned to England. He worked for the BBC. He was part of the lead drafter of the Williamsburg Charter. He started the Trinity Forum in 1991. Many of you have been impacted by the Trinity Forum. He's edited or written 30 books, including the bestseller The Call, and more recently, The Global Public Square. Really encourage you to read both and many other of his books. He's married to Jenny. He has one son, CJ, who lives and works in New York City. And Dr. Guinness, I'd like to thank you for your investment in my life, your willingness to be available. One of the things that I was able to do over the last 8 years was have Oz come and speak at some of our events, and he walks the talk. And so thank you for that witness. Dr. David Wells, our own Dr. David Wells, taught at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School and chaired its division of systematic theology. He arrived at Gordon-Conwell in 1979. My father was a student here at that time, and so he's been there for a long time. Moved to his current position in 2008 after serving as the Andrew Much Distinguished Professor of Historical and Systematic Theology since 1991. In addition to teaching, Dr. Wells is involved with a number of ministries. He serves on the board of the Rafiki Foundation, whose goal is to establish orphanages in schools in 10 African countries in order to raise and train orphans. He was born in South Africa, and he has written many impactful books, including Above All Earthly Powers, and more recently, God and the Whirlwind, How the Holy Love of God Reorients Our World. Powerful book on the holiness of God and the love of God. And Dr. Wells, thanks for your investment in this school, the impact that you've made. And so please join me in giving a warm welcome for Dr. David Wells and Dr. Os Guinness.
Shall I go? Well, thank you very much indeed, Andrew. It's a wonderful privilege for Oz and I to be here today, and I know that both of us are so appreciative of this moment. Now, the way this is going to proceed, I'm going to make a few rambling, disconnected comments about globalization, and then Oz is going to come up and make something of it. He's going to redeem the situation. I am teeing the ball up, and he's going to hit it far and true, all the way down the fairway, because that's what he does. He will come up here and reach into his photographic memory and pull out a folder and simply deliver it flawlessly. I, by contrast, am lost without my notes. That's why they're in front of me. Well, the new moment, let me quickly illustrate this. My father was born in 1898. As a young man, he joined the British cavalry. This was just before the First World War, 1914-18. He was shipped out to North Africa, and in 1916, he was involved in what turned out to be the last successful sword charge of the war. They came in on their horses, wielding their swords. It was the last one because a terrible new weapon had come to the front lines. It was the machine gun, which, of course, put an end to the cavalry. Fast forward to today. In California, there are military technicians sitting in front of their screens, watching drones over Afghanistan, and if they line up the target they want, they'll press the button and the missile will go. That has happened within a century. In fact, in little more than a lifetime. And what can be said of warfare can be said of many other aspects of our life. And part of the great change in the fabric of our life has been driven by globalization. So I want to spend just a little bit of time making sure we're all on the same page when it comes to globalization. We can think about it in two ways. The first is typically the way that economists think about it. It is less important for our purposes than the second way, because here, what we really want to focus on is this interface between Christian faith and our modernized context in which we live. But let me take the first one a little bit. I'll quickly describe it and then try to expand it a little bit the way that might be helpful to us. Then I'll get to the second point. When people talk about globalization, and if you see it in a newspaper like the Boston Globe, when people typically talk about it, they are thinking about our interlocking, interconnected economies. Had you seen the Wall Street Journal for the last 5 days or so, week, you would know that people are very carefully and warily watching China because of its declining growth. Had you watched the Wall Street Journal 2 years ago, you would have seen that investors here were very concerned about the sick economies in Europe. Now, why would they be concerned about China and the economies in Europe? The answer is, of course, because they're all interconnected, and that what happens over there affects us here. And the reverse of that is true, too. What happens here affects them over there. 5 years ago, we had a terrible housing crisis that brought the economy down with a thud, and that reverberated around the world. The fact is that economies today in the developed and developing worlds, they're not isolated islands, but we all live on a single landlocked continent. Now, part of this picture of globalization and world capitalism is that products and people move across national boundaries as if those boundaries weren't there, because they are simply following the tides of capitalism. And we've had this discussion in our own country. People coming here from many other parts of the world because they're seeking opportunity and they're seeking jobs. They want to survive. So national boundaries become irrelevant before those human hopes and needs. But the other side to this is what some of our larger corporations are doing, because they are now thinking that their labor pool isn't simply domestic. It's not just American workers. Their labor pool is in other countries too. So, if you think about American cars, you may think that you're buying a car made in America, but of course there is no such thing. These cars are assembled from parts, some of which are made here, but some of which are not. They're made perhaps in Mexico. And the reason, obviously, is that cost of living in these other countries is lower, labor costs are lower, labor and environmental laws are less stringent, they're therefore easier, and the bottom line is that the final product, when it reaches our shelf or our marketplace here, costs less. And this is not just happening with cars, it's happening with a whole range of consumer goods. Computers, TVs, clothes, look at the label, drugs, food, That shrimp that you really like probably didn't come from the Gulf Coast. It probably came from Vietnam. This aspect of globalization has the effect of discounting goods in our economy here. It makes consumer goods more accessible to more people. Globalization, therefore, is a factor. It is a factor in generating the affluence that we want so that we can buy the consumer goods that we desire. Now, economists stop their analysis at this point. This is when they talk about globalization, this is what they're thinking about. Interlocked, interdependent economies, goods and people crossing boundaries, they're following the rhythms of capitalism. But before I go to our second definition, which, as I said, is more important for us, let me just take what I have described and extend it a little bit. Globalization, as I suggested, is an important factor in the creation of our consumer society, and indeed of the affluence that we have. I know all of us in this room are relatively poor, but in comparison to people in other parts of the world, we are really doing pretty well. The things that we take in our lives that we take for granted are not taken for granted in quite a few other places in the world. This consumer society in which we live creates an environment that is so potent, it has such enormous capacity to enter our consciousness, that what happens once it enters our internal life, we begin to think of our own lives in terms of buying and selling and having and possessing. It's this ethos, this consumer ethos, that impinges on our consciousness. Now, let me give you just three quick illustrations. In the evangelical world, we've seen quite a widespread attempt to rethink what the church is doing in terms of marketing the gospel. That is to say, the gospel's a product, pastors are the sales force, evangelism is the sales pitch, and the person sitting in what used to be a pew is the consumer. You cannot go to a poor country in this world and find people who think about the gospel like that. Now, it is true that the so-called health and wealth gospel has been taken by both American and European proponents to the poor parts of the world. I have encountered it in Africa. But let me say that the church has wandered through the centuries before it ever came across something like this, that we would have a gospel about health and wealth. And the only reason anybody thought about this was that its proponents came out of affluent societies. And now they're taking this gospel to the poor parts of the world. But if you go to those poor people themselves, they have never thought about the gospel this way. Let me give you a second illustration. The way romances are conducted on online dating services. Now, I hasten to tell you that I am not speaking from experience. There was a book which has just come out by Roman Krasnarek, who picks up this whole phenomenon of online dating services, and he asks an interesting question. He said, is it not the case that the way these things work, the person who goes on the online dating service has to really present themselves as a product? That is, they present the packaging online in the hope that somebody will take it off the shelf, much like one might in a supermarket. And he quotes from a Woody Allen movie, which was, of course, before this time, but there is a little insight that he points out. The Woody Allen movie, as Husbands and Wives, came out in the early 90s. It's about the fragility of marriage and its difficulty, and Woody Allen surely would know. But in this movie, there is Chester. Now, Chester is searching for a woman who likes golf, inorganic chemistry, outdoor sex, and the sounds of Bach's music. Hey, Chester, can I just say something to you? You sound like a guy going down to the mall to find a product to meet your needs. I understand about compatibility, but this is a little different. And if you ever find this woman you so desire, you're going to be in for a real shock. Because you're going to find out she's not a product. Let me give you a third quick illustration. Think about, and here illustrating the way that our consumer culture, with its buying and selling and having and possessions, shapes our internal life. Think about how we talk about time. An hour of time is, of course, the same in Asia as in Africa as here, but how we talk about it is a little different. And we typically talk about time in terms of money and possessions. We talk, for example, about spending our time as if it were money. Or if we've managed to take a shortcut, we say, well, I bought myself a little bit of time. Or if someone has been ill and lived beyond the time people thought that person would die, we say, that person is living on borrowed time. Or we talk about wasting time or saving time. It's all money terms. Or it's a possession. We say, I will do it on my own time. Or my time is my own. Or may I have a moment of your time, as if the person could take it out of their pocket and hand it over. We may not realize it, but this is peculiar to us to think about time like this. If you go into a traditional society, time is not a personal possession. Time is for everyone. It is, as it were, a common thing. It is common to all people. It's nobody's time in particular. But it is our individualism, which is so much a part of our consuming culture, that, as it were, tries to co-opt time as if it were money or a possession. Well, I give you those three quick illustrations because I simply want you to think about the fact that although economists stop their analysis early, where they're just talking about the interlocking and interdependence of economies, actually there is a much bigger picture here that we might want to keep in mind. But let me come to the second perspective, which I think is actually more important for us. And it is the interconnection of the whole world through information technologies. Let me begin with a very simple illustration. When that book that Andrew was kind enough to mention was about to roll out, I went down to Chicago, and Justin Taylor interviewed me. It was filmed, and a month ago it went up on the Crossway website. A week ago, I got an email. Some people in Brisbane, Australia, had seen the interview. They had downloaded the book on their Kindles. They had talked. They sent back an email, which of course got back here in a nanosecond. And they said, would you come to Australia? Now, I mention that not because it's unusual, but just the reverse. It is so commonplace. When I mentioned it, you probably were thinking in your mind, so? But that's my point. That's exactly my point. Something like this doesn't amaze us at all, because this is the kind of world in which we are now living. It's a world that is interconnected by information. That information is partly verbal and partly video, potentially linking everyone with everyone simultaneously and instantaneously. Now, what has happened, of course, is that our information technologies have annihilated space. They have destroyed distance. We could say that they have compressed the world for us. Compressed it in the sense that they brought the entire world close to us. Or you could put it the other way around, that they have expanded the world for the individual, because now we have become citizens of the entire world. Now, it once was that you had to be there to know. You had to see it yourself, or at least talk to someone who had seen it. But over a long period of time, this has begun to change. First, the telegraph with little snippets of information, the telephone, you could talk to someone who wasn't there, and increasingly at further and further distances, the radio, when you were spoken to by somebody who was at a distance, TV, which adds a visual component, and now the internet, which expands all of this. Now, we see and we meet people who are not in our own place or in our own time, but people who are around the world. So we really have become citizens of the world. There is a sense in which we rove, we wander through the world, and we are becoming familiar with all of its religions, its cultures, its lifestyles, its cultural habits. We are becoming familiar with them all. Or we could say these things are all entering, they're all being poured into our own internal world. Several years ago, I had the great privilege to go to China and give lectures in 8 universities there. And one of those was in Beijing. And we arrived late afternoon, and in the evening, I took a little stroll across the campus to see it. And one of the first students who came walking towards me, going in the opposite direction, I noticed she was, of course, dressed in blue jeans and a T-shirt. What else? But what I noticed was a question on the front. And the question was in English. And the question was, why can't I have it all? Now, you need to bear in mind that the universities in China are run by the communist government. So the question, why can't I have it all? Now, where did that question come from? I can tell you it did not come out of that communist context. No, this is a Western question. This is the question we ask ourselves. Why can't I have it all? And if we find out that we can't, then we think that some injustice has been done. This is our question. But today, our questions and our ways of thinking about life are seeping into other places and other cultures. And it's not a one-way street, because the traffic's coming in the opposite direction as well. Probably more goes from here out there than comes the other way because of our music, movies, and the internet. But it is, nevertheless, a two-way street. And what this is doing, and those of you who've traveled will know what I'm describing, what this is doing is producing a layer to life that you find in many different places that looks very, very similar. Whether you see it in New York or Paris or Bombay or Shanghai. And there you will counter the same fast food outlets as you do here. The blue jeans and T-shirt, the movies, the consumer impulses, the same ways of looking at life, the same cliches. The reality is that our world is now tightly laced together by lines of information, both verbal and video. And the consequences of all of this, like any technology, have both gains and costs. Technologies are like that. Nuclear technology can make electricity, and it can also make the bomb. So, very quickly, 2 gains from all of this and 1 challenge. First, and the most obvious, there is much to be said for having so much information and so much access worldwide to other people. Whether you are just checking the weather or an airline flight or renting a car in Paris or a hotel room in Edinburgh. Nothing like this has ever existed before. And it is an extraordinary gain for us. Think about our missionaries, some of whom work in places where the postal service is either non-existent or at least erratic. Those missionaries were isolated and alone, at least in terms of their home church. Now they are not. Now we are connected with them. And you can multiply that sort of example over and over. So that's so obvious, I leave it. Second, what this information technology does is to greatly heighten our global awareness. Now, in terms of the gospel, the church has always thought globally, at least as long as it was thinking of the Great Commission to go into all people groups, make disciples among all the nations. The problem was, though, that for a long period of time, the church didn't really know what the other nations were, or where they lived, or what they were like. The 19th century was a great missionary sending nation, missionaries going from the West. And when many of these missionaries came back, they were greeted by crowds that were anxious to hear what they had to say. When David Livingstone came back to London, as he did several times, the audience who attended those meetings just listened with rapt attention, because this is bringing information of a part of the world that nobody really knew about. Today, the work of exploration, in a way, has been taken over by millions of digital cameras, which upload what's happening, and in that sense, lighting up the world. We today are in no doubt what it means that we are to take the gospel to the nations, all of the people groups of the world. We are seeing this in a way that no generation has ever seen it so clearly before. I think that this is a wonderful gain. And finally, a cost. All of this information pouring into these fragile psyches of ours. This information that is bringing us closer, if you think about it, it's bringing us closer to being omnipresent throughout the world, at least in terms of knowledge, and closer to omniscience. Never has so much information been available at our fingertips as it is today. And not only our fingertips, it simply pours into us, whether we want it or not. The effect of this, the effect of being constantly aware of other religions and other worldviews and other lifestyles as we are, the effect of it is to wear down the particularities of Christian faith, and in particular, its uniqueness. 3 decades ago, there was a rather prescient TV executive who was concerned about what he was seeing on TV, not internet. This was TV 3 decades ago. His name was William Donnelly, and he wrote a book called Confetti Generation: How the New Communication Technology is Fragmenting America. What he saw was that people, so many people living in America at that time, were living in a private world, their own private worlds, in which their experiences, each one stood alone and was not connected to any of the other experiences in their life. That's where the image of the confetti came from. These experiences, as it were, just drifted down in random flight without connection to one another. That is to say, there was no worldview for people. There was no way of thinking about life in its wholeness and coherence, because for them it isn't whole and coherent. It's just isolated individual experiences. And that, he argued, is what we see visually before us on the TV screen, where side by side, without differentiation, without explanation, you have, first, a blizzard of news items, and then that stops abruptly for an ad about a deodorant or a sleek car or a vitamin supplement. And that stops abruptly. And then we see pictures of dying babies and a war zone. And then that stops abruptly. And we see a cruise ship in the Caribbean. We skip from tragedy, to idiocy, to humor, to depravity, without, as it were, skipping a beat. We will witness, he wrote, and let me say that we are now witnessing, we will witness the time when all ideas are equal, when all religions, lifestyles, and perceptions are equally valid, equally indifferent, and equally undifferentiated in every way until given value by the choice of a specific individual. This is the confetti era, when all events, ideas, and values are the same size and weight, just pale pink and green, punched out, die-cut wafers without distinction. And what Donnelly saw coming with television is now multiplied 1,000 times over with the internet. Every generation faces its own issues, and they are very different from time to time and place to place. Today, there are places in the world, as we all know, where the church is on the front lines with radical Islam. Sometimes the church is in the middle of a war zone. Sometimes the church is in a place of great poverty. There are Christians today who, if they have one meal, think it has been a good day. So there are multiple challenges. Every place, in every generation, every time, the church has its issues that it has to confront, and has to confront in the power of the gospel and live by the power of God in the face of those issues. This, I think, is a challenge that we have. Can we sustain a coherent, sturdy, biblical worldview in the face of this torrent of images and information that is reaching us? Actually, it goes a little deeper than that. The question really is, do we have the character to sustain a worldview in the face of this torrent of images and information? That, I think, is one of the central questions that we're going to have to deal with.
Great pleasure for me to be here. And this is my favorite seminary. I always wish I'd got royalties from the people I've recommended to come. It's a real pleasure to come. We came in and someone remarked on how encouraging it was to see so many here for lunch. And I remember a remark of once Winston Churchill had a lot of people come out to hear him. And he said, "This is encouraging, but imagine how many would come out to see me hanged." No, it's a delight to be here. The real difference between David and me, we're great friends, is that he's a real scholar, and I'm really a hack journalist, but it's a delight to be here. I'm not a scholar. The new moment. Very briefly, I want to give my cut on a couple of aspects. Some of our world is new, and David's been describing that. Some of our world, for those of us particularly in the West, is new because the very recent old has gone. And that creates equal challenges. A couple of stories. A few years ago, I was at Stanford, and a student asked me, if you could be a member of any generation except the one you were born in, which would you choose? You always think to yourself, what does the student or the questioner have in mind? And all sorts of fancy answers flash through my mind. Born in China, I know the great dynasties of China, the Ming and the Tang and so on. I'm a great admirer of the Greeks and the Athens of Pericles or the Rome of Trajan and Hadrian. I love my own country and the period of William Pitt and William Wilberforce. And of course, the American founding is quite extraordinary too, and I'm an admirer of that. But the answer that came to me, I'd like to be a member of your generation. Because in the global era, your generation, those of you who are rising to adulthood to go out and take your part in the world, you are described as the crunch generation. Why? If you think of all that David said about globalization, in our global era, as the world converges and is interconnected, it's bringing together challenges that are absolutely unprecedented for human beings. Economic, environmental, accelerated technology moving towards singularity and all that. And you could go down to all sorts of areas. Now, here's the point. Your generation is going to have to answer those questions well, or humanity is in trouble. And if you answer them badly, or you just drift, humanity is in trouble. So your generation is described as the crunch generation. Now, that challenge comes home to us as followers of Jesus because there is no faith in history that has the record of the Christian gospel and the Christian church tackling evils. Just think of our great traditions of reform, the banning of infanticide, the end of the gladiatorial games, Las Casas against the conquistadores, William Wilberforce, slavery. Go right down, prison reform, Elizabeth Fry, many others, right down to Martin Luther King. Almost all those great reforms, well, all of those, but almost all the reforms that were led by people of faith, inspired by Jesus and the gospel. We're good at that. But the sort of questions I'm talking about now are more abstract. They're not palpably evil in that way. And yet they will have to be answered equally constructively if humankind in the globalized era is going to march forward. So that's the first thing I'd say to you. There's a new world. David's described it well. You could argue that that's the grand global questions. It is the crunch of the world's converging questions. As a social scientist, I would argue, having read a huge amount of the literature, crunch works in terms of the grand global issues. We've also got to look at one great sociologist calls the melting of the modern world. There are a lot of metaphors used. But one of them to describe the interconnectivity, the mobility, the freedom, all sorts of things that come out of what David said, is simply the melting down of all traditional structures. Identity used to be given your family and your father's job or your mother's, whatever. Now, as they say, no longer ascribed, it's achieved. And in our world where you can not only choose your identity, you can change your gender, all sorts of things. In other words, any solidity is literally melting down in this highly flexible, fluid world. And the same is true of almost all institutions from the family upwards. Now, how to really stand for solid Christian positions and institutions in this world is incredibly challenging. So you cannot afford to do anything but keeping up, not in a gee whiz sense, incredible new app or what? No. What are the implications of these things, first for humanness, and secondly for discipleship? Because we, tomorrow, will be the representatives of Christ's view of humanity in a world where almost everything is called into question. And you better be clear not only of your own faith and of deep theology, but of what these questions mean for humanity and for Christian faith and discipleship, and then by God's grace, individually and communally, represent it courageously before the Lord and the watching world. So there is a new world. That's one thing. But the second story I was in China a number of years ago, David, a different university, and I was in a CEO forum in Shanghai in the business school, and there were 300 Marxist CEOs. Fascinating day. 6-foot birthday cake for the party. It was extraordinary. And talking about cell phones and things, they had a platform on which 10 of us sat the whole day, and at any one moment, there were at least 6 people talking as loud as I am now on their cell phone while things were going on. It was chaos. Anyway, at the end of the day, it was a magnificent banquet, and I walked back with the dean of the business school to the final lecture. And he said, "May I ask you a question which I wouldn't ask in public?" I said, "By all means." He said, "What am I missing? We in China are fascinated with the Christian roots of your Western past for the sake of China's future." And we've been discussing how things like reforms and the universities and modern science, all these various things came out of the Christian faith as the gifts of the gospel to the West. But he finished and said, "What am I missing? You in the West are cutting off your roots." And we are. The technical term for this is a crisis of delegitimation, or a crisis of cultural authority. Or put much more simply, we in the West are a cut flower civilization. We owe a good deal to the Greeks, we owe a good deal to the Romans, a huge amount to the Hebrews, but many of the decisive gifts that have made the West are directly from the gospel. And you can see today that they're being cut off. And there's a lot of analysis how America, if you think of the crunch in terms of the global challenge, here the challenge is often put in terms of vacuum. Vacuum. Incidentally, those of you from China, the word is used then. Anyway, that's not my point today. Vacuum. What do they mean? If you look at the underpinnings of the West today, once Jewish and Christian, there are 3 parts that are creating this vacuum. First, instead of a Christian and Jewish consensus, you have an extreme diversity of values and a conflict of voices. Secondly, there are many who are using the old terms and the old values, but with a decisively changed meaning, such as freedom. No longer means what the framers thought or what Jesus and the Christian tradition thought, but the same word is there, although the hollowness is deep. But then thirdly, many of the leading intellectuals today have undercut the foundation for many of the things that are vital for this civilization. For example, human dignity. Human dignity came in the West out of the fact of the belief that everyone was made in the image of God. And you can literally see now, including down the road at Harvard, many of our new atheists struggling to give a foundation for human dignity. And you have articles like the stupidity of dignity, the uselessness of dignity. And the fact is that other atheists, say, like John Gray, the English philosopher, are mocking the secular humanists because their views of human dignity are parasitic on the Jewish and Christian faith. They can't ground them themselves. Now, put those 3 things together, you have an extraordinary vacuum underlying our Western world, which is more and more showing through and a key factor in the decline of the West. So, a new world, a new moment, or whatever the title was that Andrew gave me. Think of it in terms of the new. There are unprecedented things happening in our world. But also think of it in terms of the new because the old has gone. But rather than press that any further, I want to say a little bit about David and me. We met as students. I was in my early 20s at taking theology at London University. I won't betray the mischievous things he got up to. But that world was a world, I would say, we had magnificent, deep, biblical, evangelical theology and exposition. If I went to the London University Christian Fellowship, the QCO so-called, we had Martin Lloyd-Jones, John Stott, Jim Packer. These were our speakers, people who are legendary. We didn't lack that. But this was the early to mid-60s. You had the explosion of the counterculture through the West, the arriving of swinging London, films like Ingmar Bergman's, Antonioni, Fellini, the early Beatles, all sorts of things exploding around us, and no Christian leader I knew addressed any of them. So we had these great blocks of magnificent theology, and I loved what was going on in London and keeping in touch with it, but there was no way of relating it. And then for me, I heard this funny little man with Swiss knickers talking about lines of despair, and he connected all the dots. I'd become a Christian in 1960, but that was obviously much more important than what happened later. But the effect of Francis Schaeffer with an understanding of the Christian faith related to philosophy, to art, to culture, to film, to all these things going on, that was practically more revolutionary in my life even than my conversion. And my excitement was incredible. Now, I just heard him once in London and was intrigued. David went out there and in 1 week met and was engaged to his wife. And then he urged me to go there. And I must say, he said something like, you'll meet a fine American girl or whatever. So, a little later, I did. It wasn't quite so fast as he was. But I went out then. I will never forget the first 3 weeks. Seeing evening after evening after evening after lecture after discussion, how the Christian faith related to the whole of life. It blew my mind. That's a wretched, inadequate phrase. I would wander out in the evening under the stars, just overcome with the wonder of the immensity of Christian truth and the awesomeness of the gospel related to our modern world. So I owe that to David. But then I worked at L'Abri. I actually lived with Francis and Edith Schaeffer 3 years. I realized at the end of that, most of it was the history of ideas. Very important, but it never described things that David's discussing, information technology, consumerism at all. And I was actually dissatisfied. And then coming back to Europe, I wasn't disgruntled or anything, but just knew that the history of ideas, or put it that way, faith become theology, become the history of ideas, it didn't fit the whole of life. And then I came across Peter Berger with his understanding of the sociology of knowledge and how you have to look at institutions and technology and all the sort of things that David was describing to really understand the world, because the world isn't just the product of ideas, it's the product of all these technological advances too. And that, for me, was equally revolutionary. And when I was doing my doctorate at Oxford on that sort of area, once again, my mind was blown. Now, many decades later, I've had the privilege of being in most of the continents and met many of the world leaders, but I am more and more overwhelmed with the wonder of the gospel related to the whole of life. And in all that, friendship. I hope you will finish here at Gordon-Conwell with friends who will be your friends for life, who will share the deep commitments of faith, but will be exploring all the crazy new things that our generation throws up now, but for you in the future when David and I are long gone, but to know you have people who will be standing with you to the end of your days as brothers in Christ. Not my life verse, it is some other. One of my favorite verses is Acts 13:36. You remember that chapter? Paul is soaring in his description of Jewish history and so on. He compares David and King David and Jesus. And then the little throwaway line, he says, as for David, when he had served God's purpose in his generation, he fell asleep. We're not responsible for the whole world, only for our own callings. We're not responsible for the people that came before us. You're not responsible for your children and grandchildren who come after you, except for setting them off. But we are responsible for our generation. And there's no question that your generation is going to be one of the most critical generations in human history. James Lovelace, no Christian, the man who coined the term Gaia, he would say that we have to take, as he put it, the startup manual for civilization and embed it in concrete for future generations, because it's going to be lost unless we keep it alive in the next generation. Our Astronomer Royal in England, a great scientist at Cambridge, Martin Rees, Lord Martin Rees, he says it's a 50-50 question whether civilization will survive this century. He's an atheist who actually attends church every Sunday evening. But he says, as an atheist, the present generation, it sounds almost far-fetched, but he's a very serious scientist. He says, the present generation is more critical for the future of the cosmos than anything in time and space back to the Big Bang. Now, of course, we wouldn't agree with that, because certain events happened in the first century which are far more important than that. But you can see from that what he was saying about the critical nature of your generation. So you've got to understand the world, its great opportunities. What we're seeing through what David described is everything the first century church faced with the Greek language and the Roman roads, or the 16th century with sailing ships and so on. Incredible opportunities, probably as great as anything back to the apostles. But challenges too. Maybe as great as anything back to the apostles. And your generation is, for better or worse, the crunch generation. So use your time well here and rise up to the challenge the Lord is putting before you with courage and without fear. Now, both going to...
have offered to give us about 25 minutes or so of Q&A. If you need to leave, obviously, please feel free to do so. But what a privilege it will be to dialogue with them for 25 or so minutes, so maybe even longer. We'll see. So who's got the first question? No pressure. Yep. Yep.
You have a captive, relatively young audience. I believe you're speaking to my daughter's generation and not mine. But if you were the parent, the speaker, the mentor of any one of these individuals, you gave them encouragement to step out with courage and not fear. How would you trim down the gospel for them? A 2-minute takeaway, perhaps.
Trim it down?
Well, send them out with the essentials,
Choose another
the
word.
Foundations.
To me, trimmers are the disaster. You try and trim the gospel to fit the modern ideas. That's a dreadful term. But I know you didn't mean that.
Thank you.
No, Einstein put it well. We always got to make things as simple as we can, but never more simple than we should. Never simplistic. My own view of apologetics is that in America, there are far too many recipes and formulae. Jesus never spoke to two people the same way, and nor should we. In other words, in his case, he knew the heart immediately, so he could speak. We don't. And while we pray, we have to love and love through listening. And listening to find out where people are, and above all, discover if they're really open to the gospel, in which case it will be good news, or whether they're closed to the gospel, in which case good news is like water off a duck's back, because they're not in a bad situation. Now we have to pray, listen, and discern, and discover where they are, and then think of the gospel and relate it precisely to this person, whoever they are. But it'll be different for everybody. So I would say to you all, any canned method you have, chuck it out. Now, let me put it provocatively, okay? I hope this is not... You think of... Talk about globalization. You think of American franchising. The two classic examples are the franchising of food, McDonald's, and the franchising of entertainment, Disney. You got it. Both of those were founded in 1955 in LA. And the same time, another method was founded that had 4 steps to it. I'll leave you to work out what they were. That was the same simplification, formula, recipe style, founded in California in the mid-50s. And it's wrong. You can't reduce the gospel to a recipe. It has to be individually tailored to the heart of the person you're talking to. Now, in terms of kids, Schaeffer used to say very simply, the secret is keeping them a little ahead of all the things of love, of course. But in terms of culture, keeping them a little ahead of the game so it doesn't come as a surprise. In other words, we have to be ahead of the game, watching the sort of trends David said, so that our kids are up to date on all these things and are not caught by surprise and just washed away with the flood. What would you add, David?
Oh, no. I think the only thing I would add is that the gospel combines 2 things that we sometimes find it hard to hold together, and it is simplicity and profundity. It is so simple that the simplest person on the face of the earth can understand its message. It is so profound that none of us have totally plumbed its depths. And I think what Oz described at L'Abri, I had exactly the same experience. And what I saw was that the gospel that I had believed when I was in South Africa, and John Stott was actually the university missioner, it was a straightforward, crystal clear biblical gospel. But what I saw was that it contained within its truths, a way of comprehending all of life. And that was just tremendously encouraging and challenging to me, to begin to see that those simple truths had great, profound depths beneath them.
David, it's fair to say that John himself knew he'd been too simple in the early days.
He did.
I was a member of a group with him, and we went to films and we went to plays and so on, and he really wrestled with culture more and more as he got older, but always biblically faithful.
Yes, it was actually a remarkable thing to see somebody moving along in life in years.
Older than I am.
And John Stott, he never really gave up on it. He continued trying to work on understanding the culture. But he did say to me right towards the end that he felt he'd been sort of stumped by the culture. He just found it so difficult to comprehend. But he tried.
You got the mic behind you.
Thank you for coming. How might you teach the concepts of sovereignty and authority to a generation that is drunk so deeply of individualism?
Well, obviously, you've got to teach it, but it's the application of it that really counts. For example, Americans have always been weak in sovereignty because you're Republicans. No, I don't mean, I'm not a poke, but because you're Republicans, you have no king. It used to be said, no king but Jesus. Now you're all rugged individualists and Republicans, you don't care about any king. But in other words, you have to tackle what shapes people's resistance to sovereignty. One thing is fear. The dominant emotion in the world is fear. We should have no fear. The Lord is sovereign. But sovereignty tackles individualism. It tackles that Republican self-government notion. I meant with a small r, not the capital R. In other words, you teach the truth and apply it in the teeth of all the things that are distorting it. And there are many here in America.
You know, the backside of that is that there are a lot of young people who, if you press the question with them, would tell you how bad life is when you actually have no authority.
Yeah.
So you spoke of the confetti effect with, I guess, consuming media, and I think you said it was about 3 decades ago. So definitely before internet and when television channels were, maybe 10 to 20, I suppose. And I think anyone from my generation, our generation, under 30, we've all experienced a confetti effect with the internet and with social media. I think the difference with us now is like the curation of what content we receive. So the only real content that comes across one of our screens is something that we've told that we want to see. And if we don't like it, we reject it. And if we like it, we like it. We click like on it. And so I think trying to apply that to relationships, And so for us, when we hear the word community, or friendship, it means something very different than what it would mean to anyone before our generation who, anyone here who's under 30, we've spent our entire adult lives representing ourselves online. And that's something that no other generation has done. So how would you, or what advice would you give us from a generation who didn't, have to have 2 dual relationships, who you are when you meet someone with a handshake, who you are when you meet someone online? There's a very different type of introduction and socialization that comes along with that. So what would you say just about building friendships in a world that was before the internet? And what did that look like? And what skills do we need to make sure that we still have, that we don't lose, that maybe went along with your generation, your definitions of community and your definitions of friendship?
So, do you have a hard question you want to ask?
Well, I would like to hear your experience with building relationships in a world before having to represent yourself online, before having to wonder if friendship means your friends on Facebook or your friends in real life, and what that was like.
Well, the problem that we all face, and we don't have a choice as to where we're going to live. So we live in this context, and we can't flee it. We can't find a burrow and disappear into it. We have to work with it, and work with it from a specifically Christian understanding. The problem that we all have is that we have so few things in common. So few experiences in common. If I can just go back to this thing of movies, there was a time not too long ago in America where if you lived in most towns, there would be one movie theater. And on Saturday night, if anybody went to a movie, on Saturday night they would see the same movie. Then you had these multiplexes being built. Now you have Netflix. And you probably can't find somebody else who saw the same movie as you did on Saturday night. And you can multiply that kind of thing over and over. So we start out from the place that we have no common life, or very little common life, very few things that we share together and that we can talk about together. What we have is mediated experiences. So I would say that what we have to try to do is work to build up those common experiences with one another. And it really does take time. It's not easy to do. And it's especially not easy to do because communication online really does open itself to a disengagement from what is true. There's been a lot written about how today people are into the management of the impressions that they create. But of course, on the internet, you have the possibility of a complete disengagement between the impression a person leaves on the internet, even somewhat innocent impressions on Facebook and so on, and who the person actually is. So we really have to work at this matter of integrity. Integrity really is the root of good friendships, where the person consistently, within our sinfulness, consistently is who they say they are. I think, and I know Oz will agree with this, that I think the thing that almost more than anything else struck me about John Stott, because I lived with him for a number of years, is the total consistency between the public person and the private person at home. If you have that sort of integrity, friendships can be sustained. And when that integrity isn't there, friendships very quickly get ruined. This is, I think, where we have to try to work.
I would say in answer to that, the New Testament ideal of community is probably the very toughest challenge to live today in our highly mobile, strung-out world. But in other words, you've got to always keep the contrast between what we're called to in Jesus and what the world is pressing us to do. I'll give you an example. Many years ago when I was a graduate student, we had David Martin, one of the world's great sociologists, happens to be an Anglican minister too. And there were some charismatic students came in, very excited. Dr. Martin, what do you think about, this is way, way back, the kiss of peace? I mean, that had swept in. People were hugging each other in the service. This was a new thing. And they were saying, isn't this fabulous? The openness, the intimacy, the kiss of peace. And David Martin just listens, I'm not impressed. They were shocked. He said, well, listen, in the traditional world, if you had the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, they saw each other Monday to Saturday. And if they gave the kiss of peace in that way, that was shocking because they knew each other inside out. You guys don't see each other. So you come to church one Sunday, don't see each other next one, and we'll have a big hug in. Often tell your neighbor God loves you. You've never seen him again. It means absolutely nothing. And he was challenging them to think sociologically, otherwise we deceive ourselves. In other words, or take another example. The Bible and the Greeks agree that we are who we are when no one sees. If you ever read Plato, the parable of Gyges the shepherd, or say the anointing of David rather than his older brothers, the Lord looks on the heart. Now, there are many accountability groups in this country, but many of them are absolutely hollow. Say you have Bob and Tom in New York, and their accountability, terrific. So they meet every Tuesday night and hold each other accountable. But they don't see each other the rest of the week. So what does Bob hold Tom accountable for? He holds him accountable for what Tom has told him he's just done. In other words, we all tailor what we've done and leave out some of the worst parts and the other. In other words, that's not accountability. And the simple fact is that anonymity has undermined ethics. In a fallen world, anonymity is absolutely crucial. And so there's a link between morality and accountability and being seen. And if you have anonymity, that link goes, and we can kid each other. And so we've got to look at some of the structures of our modern world and not kid ourselves, by comparing what the biblical challenge is calling us to and what our modern world gives us 1,000 alibis to live differently. And many of us, it's a new trend, the hug of peace, wonderful. No, a lot of it's shallow and means next to nothing. And we've got to be more honest with ourselves.
It's technology,
Okay.
David.
David Gill, I just want to thank you both so much for what you've given us. I have to say, I do believe in obeying inerrant Scripture's command to greet one another with a holy kiss. So
I don't have any
just
problem
put that
with
on the table. But my question really is a serious one. What would both of you say about the church as a counterculture? What is the potential and what needs to happen for our local churches to become a little bit serving the function that Labrie did for both of you to transform people's perspective as well as their behavior toward these things? The church as a counterculture, what's the path forward?
Put simply, we have to return to the ways of the kingdom, and that is being done for us in the West the more we become a despised group. And you can see that for several hundred years, Western Christians have had it easy, and the complacency has led to worldliness. And now we're more shaped by the world than we are by the gospel. And the more we're rejected, which increasingly we are, we go, oh, and we're going back, I think, in more and more areas to say, what does it really mean to live the way of Jesus over against the world, which is rejecting us in 100 different points? So an exploration of the way of Jesus, but also an understanding of the times when we are being more and more rejected, and we have been incredibly worldly compared to the churches, say, in Asia and Africa. He wants your word too.
Oh, David.
Short answer?
Look, we all know what the church is, or should be, what the church is in New Testament terms. We can say that it is an outpost in this world of the age to come. The age to come is dawning. It's not yet consummated. We are not there yet. The realizations are incomplete in ourselves and in the church. We know ourselves to be fully redeemed inasmuch as we cannot and need not add to what Christ has done for us, but we know that we're not redeemed in full. So we're pilgrims, and our modeling of our life of being in Christ is always incomplete. Nevertheless, there is a model and a goal which is set forth for us in Scripture, and it is that together in a local body of believers, something of the age to come should be clearly manifested in truth, character, relationships, and service. Now, how do you get there? I think if you're a pastor, you've got to teach your way there over probably quite a long time, because the people coming into church, people, myself among them, people coming into church typically, often, come in for a fill-up on Sunday morning. So in the church, we have proximity to one another, but we don't have much community. We don't have much community because our lives don't overlap. So we greet one another in a friendly way and then leave. But local churches find it very hard to bring people's lives together for more than just that one shot on Sunday morning. It's hard to do it. We have countervailing winds just blowing in our faces. This culture makes it very, very hard to actually find community. It's very difficult. But having said that, this is where we ought to be going.
And the North Shore, to be candid, is a lot easier than LA or New York, where the mobility and the strung-out life is worse than ever. David, I'd add one thing. I was quoting yesterday historian of Christendom. In Christendom arose the first all-Christian society. And one historian, who happened to be the nephew of the Holy Roman Emperor, he said, I set about trying to copy Augustine and write the story of two cities. He said, I now realize, really, I'm writing the story of one city, the city of God. In other words, Christendom was it. And what happened is they thought they were all Christian. They lost the prophetic critique. And as we can see from the Old Testament, even the prophets needed prophets because you had false prophets. And the church has lost that prophetic critique today of its immense worldliness in this country.
I just want to say, first of all, thank you for both of you. I've been enriched by both of your writings, and it's an awesome privilege to be here listening to you. My question is going to comment kind of probably something that's already been hit a little bit, but anyway, and like you, I need my notes, so I've been scribbling for a minute now. Reformation movements, to me, seem to affect many people who are under the same worldview or paradigm in the past. So the Hellenization of the whole Greek world allowed for the diaspora synagogues to spread the gospel to multiple places with people who operated under a similar worldview. the same thing in the medieval world with the printing press. But today we have multiple sub-pockets of disparate worldviews and disparate thinking. And if I think to myself as a future pastor, how do I work towards revival? How do I work towards renewal when I'm looking at people who don't share the same worldview? What does revival look like, and how do I strive towards it and pray for it when I'm in such a pluralistic context?
You have to choose carefully and define what you mean by renewal, revival, resurgence. For example, coming from the social sciences, I use the word resurgence where you see an increase of religion for sociologically observable reasons. For instance, parents want their kids to have values, go back to church. Now, some of them are genuine, but the movement is not. It's merely a sociological thing. As I understand revival, it's a true outbreaking of the Word and the Spirit. It is supernatural. It's not a kind of Finney-like engineering of revival. So you look at the great revivals. My great-grandfather was in the 1859 revival, and the Spirit broke out with dramatic power. And all over Ireland, people returned goods they'd stolen and so on. It was very, very real. In that revival, all we contribute is urgent prayer and desperate need for God. See, we don't work towards revival. You can prepare the hearts of your people. We need God to speak in power through his word and through his Spirit. Now, many parts of the American church really have only a nominal relationship to the Holy Spirit. Sadly. Nothing like I read in Acts or the early church right up to Augustine and so on. So I believe that's revival, a supernatural outbreaking of the Holy Spirit through the preaching of the word in extraordinary power.
Can I just add to that? That's exactly right. If I could just add one other point, and I preface it by saying that my own convictions are to be a biblical expositor. That's what I do in my feeble way. The best preaching I have ever heard has been of that kind. So I just want to preface it by saying that. Now, to get to your question, your observation is exactly right. You have multiple worldviews probably represented in the minds of the people in that congregation. I think that today, if you're a pastor, while preaching in an expository way, over time, you have to work at building up a Christian worldview that will slowly replace what's in people's heads. If you don't do that, then what Christian faith is going to be reduced to is just an experience, and in all likelihood, an experience that's conceived therapeutically. That is to say, people come into church, they feel battered after being out in the workplace all week. They carry these wounds and thoughts of broken relationships and the terrible burdens some people carry from work and so on. They've got all of this going on in their heads. And what they want on Sunday morning is just something that will make them feel a little bit better. But if you don't give them a worldview, you may give them a good feeling that lasts for 10 minutes or half an hour. But if you're not starting to put a worldview in place, you're not enabling them to connect their Christian faith to the workplace where they are 5 or 6 days a week. And so Christian faith becomes irrelevant to anything that they know in the rest of their lives, except perhaps it might make them feel a little bit better for a while after they've been there. And that's not enough. If that's what we're producing in our churches, we're goners.